Pay differences. Thus far, the discussion has been about things affecting the demand for labor. What about supply? Employers seldom bid as much as they would if they had to, because there are other individuals willing and able to supply the same services for less. Wages and salaries serve the same economic function as other prices. That is, they guide the utilization of scarce resources which have alternative uses, so that each resource gets used where it is most valued. Yet because these scarce resources are human beings, we tend to look on wages and salaries differently from the way we look on prices paid for other inputs into the production process. Often we ask questions that are emotionally powerful, even if they are logically meaningless and wholly undefined. For example, are the wages fair? Are the workers exploited? Is this a living wage? No one likes to see fellow human beings living in poverty and squalor, and many are prepared to do something about it, as shown by the vast billions of dollars that are donated to a wide range of charities every year, on top of the additional billions spent by governments in an attempt to better the condition of poor people. These socially important activities occur alongside an economy coordinated by prices, but the two things serve different purposes. Attempts to make prices, including the prices of people's labor and talents, be something other than signals to guide resources to their most valued uses, makes those prices less effective for their basic purpose, on which the prosperity of the whole society depends. Ultimately, it is economic prosperity which makes it possible for billions of dollars to be devoted to helping the less fortunate. Income distribution. Nothing is more straightforward and easy to understand than the fact that some people earn more than others, for a variety of reasons. Some people are simply older than others, for example, and their additional years have given them opportunities to acquire more experience, skills, formal education, and on-the-job training, all of which that allow them to do a given job more efficiently, or to take on more complicated jobs that would be overwhelming for a beginner or for someone with only limited experience or training. It is hardly surprising that this leads to higher incomes. With the passing years, older individuals may also become more knowledgeable about job opportunities, while increasing numbers of other people become more aware of them and their individual abilities, leading to offers of new jobs or promotions where they are currently working. It is not uncommon for most of the people in the top 5% of income earners to be 45 years old and up. These and other common sense reasons for income differences among individuals are often lost sight of in abstract discussions of the ambiguous term income distribution. Although people in the top income brackets and bottom income brackets, the rich and the poor as they are often called, may be discussed as if they were different classes of people. Often they are, in fact, people at different stages of their lives. 3/4 of those American workers who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975 were also in the top 40% at some point over the next 16 years. This is not surprising. After 16 years, people usually have had 16 years more work experience, perhaps including on-the-job training or formal education. Those in business or the professions have had 16 years in which to build up a clientele. It would be surprising if they were not able to earn more money as a result. None of this is unique to the United States. A study of 11 European countries found similar patterns. 1/2 of the people in Greece and 2/3 of the people in Holland who were below the poverty line in a given year had risen above that line within 2 years. A study in Britain found similar patterns when following thousands of individuals over a 5-year period. At the end of 5 years, nearly 2/3 of the individuals who were initially in the bottom 10% in income had risen out of that bracket. Studies in New Zealand likewise showed significant rises of individuals out of the bottom 20% of income earners in just 1 year, and of course larger numbers rising out of this bracket over a period of several years. When some people are born, live, and die in poverty, while others are born, live, and die in luxury. That is a very different situation from one in which young people have not yet reached the income level of older people, such as their parents. But the kind of statistics often cited in the media, and even in academia, typically do not distinguish these very different situations. Moreover, those who publicized such statistics usually proceed as if they are talking about income differences between classes rather than differences between age brackets. But while it is possible for people to stay in the same income bracket for life, though they seldom do, it is not equally possible for them to stay in the same age bracket for life. Because of the movement of people from one income bracket to another over the years, the degree of income inequality over a lifetime is not the same as the degree of income inequality in a given year. A study in New Zealand found that the degree of income inequality over a working lifetime there was less than the degree of inequality in any given year during those lifetimes. Much discussion of the rich and the poor, or of the top and bottom 10 or 20%, failed to say just what kinds of incomes qualify to be in those categories. As of 2011, a household income of $101,583 was enough to put those who earned it in the top 20% of Americans. But a couple earning a little over $50,000 a year each are hardly the rich. Even to make the top 5% required a household income of just over $186,000. That is about $93,000 apiece for a working couple. That is a nice income, but rising to that level after working for decades at lower levels is hardly a sign of being rich. Describing people in certain income brackets as rich is false for a more fundamental reason. Income and wealth are different things. No matter how much income passes through your hands in a given year, your wealth depends on how much you have retained and accumulated over the years. If you receive $1 million in a year and spend $1.5 million, you are not getting rich. But many frugal people on modest incomes have been found, after their deaths, to have left surprisingly large amounts of wealth to their heirs. Even among the truly rich there is turnover. When Forbes magazine ran its first list of the 400 richest Americans in 1982, that list included 14 Rockefellers, 28 DuPonts, and 11 Hunts. 20 years later, the list included 3 Rockefellers, 1 Hunt, and no DuPonts. Just over 1/5 of the people on the 1982 Forbes list of the wealthiest Americans inherited their wealth. By 2006, however, only 2% of the people on the list had inherited their wealth. Although there is much talk about income distribution, most income is, of course, not distributed at all, in the sense in which newspapers or Social Security checks are distributed from some central place. Most income is distributed only in the figurative statistical sense in which there is a distribution of heights in a population, some people being 5'4" tall, others 6'2", etc. But none of these heights was sent out from some central location. Yet it is all too common to read journalists and others discussing how society distributes its income, rather than saying in plain English that some people make more money than others. There is no collective decision by society as to how much each individual's work is worth. In a market economy, those who get the direct benefit of an individual's goods or services decide how much they are prepared to pay for what they receive. People who would prefer collective decision-making on such things can argue their case for that particular method of decision-making. But it is misleading to suggest that today society distributes its income with one set of results and should simply change to distributing its income with different results in the future. More is involved than a misleading metaphor. Often the very units in which income differences are discussed are as misleading as the metaphor. Family income or household income statistics can be especially misleading as compared to individual income statistics. An individual always means the same thing, one person. But the sizes of families and households differ substantially from one time period to another, from one racial or ethnic group to another, and from one income bracket to another. For example, a detailed analysis of U.S. Census data showed that there were 40 million people in the bottom 20% of households in 2002, but 69 million people in the top 20% of households. Although the unwary might assume that these quintiles represent dividing the country into 5 equal layers, as 2 well-known economists have misstated it in a popular book, there is nothing equal about those layers. They represent grossly different numbers of people. Not only do the numbers of people differ considerably between low-income households and high-income households, the proportions of people who work also differ by very substantial amounts between these households. In the year 2010, the top 20% of households contained 20.6 million heads of households who worked, compared to 7.5 million heads of households who worked in the bottom 20% of households. These striking disparities do not even take into account whether they are working full-time or part-time. When it comes to working full-time the year-round, even the top 5% of households contain more heads of households who worked full-time for 50 or more weeks than did the bottom 20%. That is, there were more heads of households in absolute numbers, 4.3 million versus 2.2 million, working full-time and year-round in the top 5% of households compared to the bottom 20%. At one time, back in the 1980s, people in the top 10% in income worked fewer hours than the people in the bottom 10%. But that situation has long since reversed. We are no longer talking about the idle rich versus the toiling poor. Today we are usually talking about those who work regularly and those who, in most cases, do not work regularly or at all. Under these conditions, the more that pay for work increases, the more income inequality increases. Among the top 6% of income earners in a survey published in the Harvard Business Review, 62% worked more than 50 hours a week, and 35% worked more than 60 hours a week. The sizes of families and households have differed not only from one income bracket to another at a given time, but also have differed over time. These differences are not incidental. They radically change the implications of trends in income distribution statistics. For example, real income per American household rose only 6% over the entire period from 1969 to 1996, but real per capita income rose 51% over that same period. The discrepancy is due to the fact that the average size of families and households was declining during those years, so that smaller households, including some with only one person, were now earning about the same as larger households had earned a generation earlier. Looking at a still longer period, from 1967 to 2007, real median household income rose by 30% over that span, but real per capita income rose by 100% over that same span. Declining numbers of persons per household were the key to these differences. Rising prosperity contributed to the decline in household size. As early as 1966, the U.S. Bureau of the Census reported that the number of households was increasing faster than the number of people, and concluded, the main reason for the more rapid rate of household formation is the increased tendency, particularly among unrelated individuals, to maintain their own homes or apartments rather than live with relatives or move into existing households as roomers, lodgers, and so forth. Yet these consequences of rising prosperity generate household income statistics that are widely used to suggest that there has been no real economic progress. A Washington Post writer, for example, declared, "The incomes of most American households have remained stubbornly flat over the past 3 decades." It might be more accurate to say that some writers have remained stubbornly blind to economic facts. When 2 working people in one household today earn the same total amount of money that 3 working people were earning in one household in the past, that is a 50% increase in income per person, even when household income remains the same. Despite some confused or misleading discussions of the rich and the poor, based on people's transient positions in the income stream, genuinely rich and genuinely poor people do exist. People who are going to be living in luxury or in poverty all their lives. But they are much rarer than gross income statistics would suggest. Just as most American poor do not stay poor, so most rich Americans were not born rich. 4/5 of American millionaires earned their fortunes within their own lifetimes, having inherited nothing. Moreover, the genuinely rich are rare, like the genuinely poor. Even if we take $1 million in net worth as our criterion for being rich, only about 3.5% of American households are at that level. This is, in fact, a fairly modest level, given that net worth counts everything from household goods and clothing to the total amount of money in an individual's pension fund. If we count as genuinely poor that 5% of the population which remains in the bottom 20% over a period of years, then the genuinely rich and the genuinely poor, put together, add up to less than 10% of the American population. Nevertheless, some political rhetoric might suggest that most people are either haves or have-nots. Trends over time. If our concern is with the economic well-being of flesh-and-blood human beings, as distinguished from statistical comparisons between income brackets, then we need to look at real income per capita, because people do not live on percentage shares. They live on real income. Among those Americans who were in the bottom 20% in 1975, 98% had higher real incomes in 1991, and 2/3 had higher real incomes in 1991 than the average American had back in 1975, when they were in the bottom 20%. Even when narrowly focusing on income brackets, the fact that the share of the bottom 20% of households declined from 4% of all income in 1985 to 3.5% in 2001 did not prevent the real income of the households in this bracket from rising by thousands of dollars in absolute terms, quite aside from the movement of actual people out of the bottom 20% between the 2 years. Radically different trends are found when looking at statistics based on comparisons of top and bottom income brackets over time, rather than following individual income earners over the same span of time. For example, it is a widely publicized fact that census data show the percentage of the national income going to those in the bottom 20% bracket has been declining over the years, while the percentage going to those in the top 20% has been rising, and the amount going to those in the top 1% has been rising especially sharply. This has led to the familiar refrain that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, a notion that provides the media with the kind of dramatic and alarming news stories that sell newspapers and attract television audiences, as well as being ideologically satisfying to some and politically useful to others. The real question, however, is it true? A diametrically opposite picture is found when comparing what happens to specific individuals over time. Unfortunately, most statistics, including those from the U.S. Bureau of the Census, do not follow particular individuals over time, even though the illusion that they do may be fostered by data on income categories over time. Among the few studies which have actually followed individual Americans over time, one from the University of Michigan and another from the Internal Revenue Service, show patterns similar to each other, but radically different from the often cited patterns in data from the Census Bureau and other sources. The University of Michigan study followed the same individuals from 1975 through 1991, and the Internal Revenue Service study followed individuals through their income tax returns from 1996 through 2005. The University of Michigan study found that among working Americans who were in the bottom 20% in income in 1975, approximately 95% had risen out of that bracket by 1991, including 29% who had reached the top quintile by 1991, compared to only 5% who still remained in the bottom quintile. The largest absolute amount of increase in income between 1975 and 1991 was among those people who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1975, and the least absolute increase in income was among those who were initially in the top quintile in 1975. In other words, the incomes of people who were initially at the bottom rose more than the incomes of people who were initially at the top. This is the direct opposite of the picture presented by census data, based on following income brackets over time instead of following the people who are moving in and out of those brackets. Similar patterns appeared in statistics from the Internal Revenue Service, which also followed given individuals. The IRS found that between 1996 and 2005, the income of individuals who had been in the bottom 20% of income tax filers in 1996 had increased by 91% by 2005, and the income of those individuals who were in the top 1% in 1996 had fallen by 26%. It may seem almost impossible that the data from the Bureau of the Census and the data from the IRS and the University of Michigan can all be correct, but they are. Studies of income brackets over time and studies of individual people over time are measuring fundamentally different things that are often confused with one another. A study of individual incomes over time in Canada turned up patterns very similar to those in the United States. During the period from 1990 to 2009, Canadians who were initially in the bottom 20% had both the highest absolute increase in income and the highest percentage increase in income. Only 13% of the Canadians who were initially in the bottom quintile in 1990 were still there in 2009, while 21% of them had risen all the way to the 21% of them had risen all the way to the top quintile. Whatever the relationship between one income bracket and another, that is not necessarily the relationship between people, because people are moving from one bracket to another as time goes on. Therefore, the fate of brackets and the fate of people can be very different, and in many cases completely opposite. When income-earning Americans in the bottom income bracket have their incomes nearly double in a decade, they end up no longer in the bottom bracket. There is nothing mysterious about this, since most people begin their careers in entry-level jobs, and their growing experience over the years leads to higher incomes. Nor is it surprising that people whose incomes are at the peak of the income pyramid seem often also to be at or near their own peak incomes, and do not continue to rise as dramatically as those who started at the bottom. Some Americans reach the top 1% in income, approximately $369,500 and up in 2010, in a given year because of some particular boost to their income during that particular year. Someone who sells a house may have an income that year which is some multiple of the income received in any year before or since. Similarly, for someone who receives a large inheritance in a given year or cashes in stock options that have been accumulating over the years, such spikes in income account for a substantial proportion of those whose incomes in a given year reach the top levels. More than half the people in the top 1% in income in 1996 were no longer at that level in 2005. Among those who were in the top 1/100th of 1% in income in 1996, 3/4 were no longer at that level in 2005. Many people who never have a spike in income that would put them in the top 1% may nevertheless end up in the top 20% after many years of moving up in the course of a career. They are not rich in any meaningful sense, even though they may be called that in political, media, or even academic rhetoric. As already noted, the amount of income required to reach the top 20% is hardly enough to live the lifestyle of the rich and famous, nor will being in the top 1% for that half of the people in that bracket, nor will being in the top 1% for that half of the people in that bracket who do not remain there. Just as there are spikes in income from time to time, so there are troughs in income in particular years. Thus, many people who are genuinely affluent, or even rich, can have business losses or off years in their professions or investments, so that their income in a given year may be very low, or even negative, without their being poor in any meaningful sense. This may help explain such anomalies as hundreds of thousands of people with incomes below $20,000 a year who are living in homes costing $300,000 and up. The fundamental confusion that makes income bracket data and individual income data seem mutually contradictory is the implicit assumption that people in particular income brackets at a given time are an enduring class at that level. If that were true, then trends over time in comparisons between income brackets would be the same as trends over time between individuals. Because that is not the case, however, the two sets of statistics lead not only to different conclusions, but even to opposite conclusions that seem to contradict each other. The higher up the income scale people are, the more volatile are their incomes. During the past 3 recessions, the top 1% of earners, those making $380,000 or more in 2008, experienced the largest income shocks in percentage terms of any income group in the U.S., the Wall Street Journal reported. When the incomes of people making $50,000 or less fell by 2% between 2007 and 2009, the incomes of people making $1 million or more fell by nearly 50%. Conversely, when the economy grows, the income of the top 1% the incomes of the top 1% grow up to 3 times faster than the rest of the countries. This is not really surprising, since incomes at the highest levels are less likely to be due to salaries and more likely to be due to income from investments or sales, both of which can vary greatly when the economy goes up or down. Similar patterns apply to wealth as to income. During the 1990 and 2001 recessions, the richest 5% of Americans, measured by net worth, experienced the largest decline in their wealth, the Wall Street Journal reported. Differences in skills. Among the many reasons for differences in productivity and pay is that some people have more skills than others. No one is surprised that engineers earn more than messengers, or that experienced shipping clerks tend to earn higher pay than inexperienced shipping clerks, and experienced pilots tend to earn more than either. Although workers may be thought of as people who simply supply labor, what most people supply is not just their ability to engage in physical exertions, but also their ability to apply mental proficiency to their tasks. The time when a strong back and a weak mind were sufficient for many jobs is long past in most modern economies. Obvious as this may seem, its implications are not equally obvious nor always widely understood. In those times and places where physical strength and stamina have been the principal work requirements, productivity and pay have tended to reach their peak in the youthful prime of life, with middle-aged laborers receiving less pay or less frequent employment, or both. A premium on physical strength likewise favored male workers over female workers. In some desperately poor countries living close to the edge of subsistence, such as China in times past, the sex differential in performing physical labor was such that it was not uncommon for the poorest people to kill female infants. While a mother was necessary for the family, an additional woman's productivity in arduous farm labor on small plots of land with only primitive tools might not produce enough food to keep her alive, and her drain on the food produced by others would threaten the survival of the whole family, at a time when malnutrition and death by starvation were ever-present dangers. One of the many benefits of economic development has been making such desperate and brutal choices unnecessary. The rising importance of skills and experience relative to physical strength has changed the relative productivities of youth compared to age, and of women compared to men. This has been especially so in more recent times, as the power of machines has replaced human strength in industrial societies, and as skills have become crucial in high-tech economies. Even within a relatively short span of time, the age at which most people receive their peak earnings has shifted upwards. In 1951, most Americans reached their peak earnings between 35 and 44 years of age, and people in that age bracket earned 60% more than workers in their early 20s. By 1973, however, people in the 35 to 44-year-old bracket earned more than double the income of the younger workers. 20 years later, the peak earnings bracket had moved up to people aged 45 to 54 years, and people in that bracket earned more than 3 times what workers in their early 20s earned. Meanwhile, the dwindling importance of physical strength also reduced or eliminated the premium for male workers in an ever-widening range of occupations. This did not require all employers to have enlightened self-interest. Those who persisted in paying more for male workers who were not correspondingly more productive were at a competitive disadvantage compared to rival firms that got their work done at lower costs by eliminating the male premium, equalizing the pay of women and men to match their productivities. The most unenlightened or prejudiced employers had higher labor costs, which risked the elimination of their businesses by the ruthlessness of the market competition. Thus, the pay of women began to equal that of men of similar qualifications even before there were laws mandating equal pay. While the growing importance of skills tended to reduce economic inequalities between the sexes, it tended to increase the inequality between those with skills and those without skills. Moreover, rising earnings in general, growing out of a more productive economy with more skilled people, tended to increase the inequality between those who worked regularly and those who did not. As already noted, there are striking differences between the numbers and proportions of people who work and those who don't work, as between the top income brackets and the bottom income brackets. Simultaneous rise in rewards for work and a growing welfare state that allows more people to live without working virtually guarantees increasing inequality in earnings and income, when many of the welfare state benefits are received in kind rather than in money, such as subsidized housing or subsidized medical care, since these benefits are not counted in income statistics. One of the seemingly most obvious reasons for different individuals or nations to live at very different economic levels is that they produce at very different economic levels. As economies grow more technologically and economically more complex, and the work less physically demanding, those individuals with higher skills are more in demand and more highly rewarded. The growing disparities between upper-level income brackets and lower-level income brackets are hardly surprising under these conditions. Job discrimination. While pay differences often reflect differences in skill, experience, or willingness to do hard or dangerous work, these differences may also reflect discrimination against particular segments of society, such as ethnic minorities, women, lower castes, or other groups. However, in order to determine whether there is discrimination or how severe it is, we first need to define what we mean. Sometimes discrimination is defined as judging individuals from different groups by different standards when hiring, paying, or promoting. In its severest form, this can mean refusal to hire at all. "No Irish need apply" was a stock phrase in advertisements for many desirable jobs in the 19th century and early 20th century America. Before World War II, Many hospitals in the United States would not hire black doctors or Jewish doctors, and some prestigious law firms would not hire anyone who was not a white Protestant male from the upper classes. In other cases, people might be hired from a number of groups, but individuals from different groups were channeled into different kinds of jobs. None of this has been peculiar to the United States or to the modern era. On the contrary, members of different groups have been treated differently in laws and practices all around the world and for thousands of years of recorded history. It is the idea of treating all individuals the same, regardless of what group they come from, that is relatively recent, as history is measured, and by no means universally observed around the world today. Overlapping with discrimination, and often confused with it, are employment differences based on substantial differences in skills, experience, work habits, and behavior patterns from one group to another. Mohawk Indians, for example, were long sought after to work on the construction of skyscrapers in the United States, for they walked around high up on the steel frameworks with no apparent fear or distraction from their work. In times past, Chinese laborers on rubber plantations in colonial Malaya were found to collect twice as much sap from rubber trees in a given amount of time as Malay workers did. While preferences for some groups and reluctance or unwillingness to hire others have often been described as due to bias, prejudice, or stereotypes, third-party observers cannot so easily dismiss the first-hand knowledge of those who are backing their beliefs by risking their own money. Even in the absence of different beliefs about different groups, application of the same employment criteria to different groups can result in very different proportions of these groups being hired, fired, or promoted. Distinguishing discrimination from differences in qualification and performances is not easy in practice, though the distinction is fundamental in principle. Seldom do statistical data contain sufficiently detailed information on skills, experience, performance, or absenteeism, much less work habits and attitudes, to make possible comparisons between truly comparable individuals from different groups. Women, for example, have long had lower incomes than men, but most women give birth to children at some point in their lives, and many stay out of the labor force until their children reach an age where they can be put into some form of daycare while their mothers return to work. These interruptions of their careers cost women workplace experience and seniority, which in turn inhibit the rise of their incomes over the years relative to that of men who have been working continuously in the meantime. However, as far back as 1971, American single women who worked continuously from high school into their 30s earned slightly more than single men of the same description, even though women as a group earned substantially less than men as a group. This suggests that employers were willing to pay women of the same experience the same as men, if only because they are forced to by competition in the labor market, and that women with the same experience may even outperform men and therefore earn more. But differences in domestic responsibilities prevent the sexes from having identical workplace experience or identical incomes based on that experience. None of this should be surprising. If, for example, women were paid only 75% of what men of the same level of experience and performance were paid, then any employer could hire 4 women instead of 3 men for the same money and gain a decisive advantage in production costs over competing firms. Put differently, any employer who discriminated against women in this situation would be incurring unnecessarily higher costs, risking profits, sales, and survival in a competitive industry. It is worth noting again the distinction made in Chapter 4 between intentional and systemic causation. Even if not a single employer consciously or intentionally thought about the economic implications of discriminating against women, the systemic effects of competition would tend to weed out over time those employers who paid a sex differential not corresponding to a difference in productivity. This process would be hastened to the extent that women set up their own businesses, as many increasingly do, and do not discriminate against other women. Substantial pay differentials between women and men are not the same across the board, but vary between those women who become mothers and those who do not. In one study, women without children earned 95% of what men earned, while women with children earned just 75% of what men earned. Moreover, even those women without children need not be in the same occupations as men. The very possibility of having children makes different occupations have different attractions to women, even before they become mothers. Occupations like librarians or teachers, which one can resume after a few years off to take care of small children, are more attractive to women who anticipate becoming mothers. But occupations such as computer engineers, where just a few years off from work can leave you far behind in this rapidly changing field, tend to be less attractive to many women. In short, women and men make different occupational choices and prepare for many of these occupations by specializing in a very different mix of subjects while being educated. The question as to whether or how much discrimination women encounter in the labor market is a question about whether there are substantial differences in pay between women and men in the same fields with the same qualifications. The question as to whether there is or is not income parity between the sexes is very different, since differences in occupational choices, educational choices, and continuous employment all affect incomes. Men also tend to work in more hazardous occupations, which usually pay more than similar occupations that are safer. As one study noted, although 54% of the workplace is male, men account for 92% of all job-related deaths. Similar problems in trying to compare truly comparable individuals make it difficult to determine the presence and magnitude of discrimination between groups that differ by race or ethnicity. It is not uncommon, both in the United States and in other countries, for one racial or ethnic group to differ in age from another by a decade or more. And we have already seen how age makes a big difference in income. While gross statistics show large income differences among American racial and ethnic groups, finer breakdowns usually show much smaller differences. For example, Black, white, and Hispanic males of the same age, 29, and IQ, 100, have all had average annual incomes within $1,000 of one another. In New Zealand, while there are substantial income differences between the Maori population and the white population, these differences likewise shrink drastically when comparing Maoris with other New Zealanders of the same age and with the same skills and literacy levels. Much discussion of discrimination proceeds as if employers are free to make whatever arbitrary decisions they wish as to hiring or pay. This ignores the fact that employers do not operate in isolation, but in markets. Businesses compete against each other for employees as well as competing for customers. Mistaken decisions incur costs in both product markets and labor markets, and, as we have seen in earlier chapters, the cost of being wrong can have serious consequences. Moreover, these costs vary with conditions in the market. While it is obvious that discrimination imposes a cost on those being discriminated against, in the form of lost opportunities for higher incomes, it is also true that discrimination can impose costs on those who do the discriminating, where they too lose opportunities for higher incomes. For example, when a landlord refuses to rent an apartment to people from the wrong group, that can mean leaving the apartment vacant for longer. Clearly, that represents a loss of rent, if this is a free market. However, if there is rent control, with a surplus of applicants for vacant apartments, then such discrimination costs the landlord nothing, since there will be no delay in finding a new tenant under those conditions. Similar principles apply in job markets. An employer who refuses to hire qualified individuals from the wrong group risks leaving his jobs unfilled longer in a free market. This means he must either leave some work undone and some orders from customers unfilled, or else pay overtime to existing employees to get the job done. Either way, this costs the employer more money. However, in a market where wages are set artificially above the level that would exist through supply and demand, the resulting surplus of job applicants can mean that discrimination costs the employer nothing, since there would be no delay in filling the job under these conditions. Whether these artificially higher wages are set by a labor union or by a minimum wage law does not change the principle. Empirical evidence strongly indicates that racial discrimination tends to be greater when the costs are lower, and lower when the costs are greater. Even in white-ruled South Africa during the era of apartheid, where racial discrimination against blacks was required by law, white employers in competitive industries often hired more blacks and in higher occupations than they were permitted to do so by the government, and were often fined when caught doing so. This was because it was in the employer's economic self-interest to hire blacks. Similarly, whites who wanted homes built in Johannesburg typically hired illegal black construction crews, often with a token white nominally in charge to meet the requirements of the apartheid laws, rather than pay the higher price of hiring a white construction crew as the government wanted them to do. White South African landlords likewise often rented to blacks in areas where only whites were legally allowed to live. The cost of discrimination to the discriminators is crucial for understanding such behavior. Employers who are spending other people's money, government agencies or nonprofit organizations, for example, are much less affected by the cost of discrimination. In countries around the world, discrimination by government has been greater than discrimination by businesses operating in private, competitive markets. Understanding the basic economics of discrimination makes it easier to understand why blacks were starring on Broadway in the 1920s, at a time when they were not permitted to enlist in the U.S. Navy, and were kept out of many civilian government jobs as well. Broadway producers were not about to lose big money that they could make by hiring black entertainers who could attract big audiences, but the costs of government discrimination were paid by the taxpayers, whether they realized it or not. Just as minimum wage laws reduce the cost of discrimination to the employers, maximum wage laws increase the employer's cost of discrimination. Among the few examples of maximum wage laws in recent centuries were the wage and price controls imposed in the United States during World War II. Because wages were not allowed to rise to the level that they would reach under supply and demand, there was a shortage of workers, just as there is a shortage of housing under rent control. Many employers who had not hired blacks or women before, or who had not hired them for desirable jobs before the war, now began to do so. The Rosie the Riveter image that came out of World War II was, in part, a result of wage and price controls.